The last meal has already been eaten, the last phone call already made, and somewhere inside the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, a man on death row wakes up knowing that before midnight, he will be strapped to a gurney 45 miles away. But how does he get there? Most people assume it's simple. A van, some guards, a drive. They are wrong. What actually happens in the hours between a death row cell and an execution gurney is one of the most controlled, psychologically intense, and legally scrutinized processes in the American criminal justice system. Every movement is documented, every second is accounted for, and every person involved from the warden to the chaplain to the transport officers is following a protocol so precise. It reads like a military operation. This is not about whether the death penalty is right or wrong. This is about what actually happens, step by step, door by door, and some of what you're about to hear will surprise you. Stay with this until the end, because the final detail about what happens inside that chamber, in the last moments before the execution begins, is something almost no documentary has ever explained properly. If you've never heard the full breakdown of how this process actually works, and what the officers, chaplains, and even the condemned themselves experience, hit subscribe right now. Because what follows is one of the most meticulously documented yet rarely discussed processes in the American justice system. And we are going through it, all of it, minute by minute. Death row in Texas is not what most people picture. The Polunsky Unit sits in Polk County, outside Livingston, a flat, pine-forested stretch of East Texas that looks almost peaceful from the road. But inside, the facility houses over 200 men on death row, each confined to a single man cell roughly 60 square feet in size. No communal dining, no group recreation in the traditional sense. 22 to 23 hours a day, alone. This is by design. Texas moved its death row population to the Polunsky Unit in 1999, separating condemned inmates from the general population entirely. Before that change, death row inmates at the Ellis Unit had more social contact. They worked, they interacted. After a series of escapes and security concerns, the state made a decision: complete isolation until the date of execution. For most men on Texas death row, years, sometimes decades, pass inside that 60-square-foot world. Then comes the date when the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles declines clemency, and when the courts have exhausted every appeal. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice sets an execution date. That date is not a surprise. The condemned inmate is formally notified. Their attorneys are notified. And the machinery of what TGAC calls execution procedures quietly begins to move. The process that leads to an actual transfer does not begin on execution day. It begins approximately 24 hours before. According to documented TGAC procedures and reporting by journalists who have covered Texas executions extensively, the condemned inmate is moved from their regular death row cell at Polunsky to what is known as the Death Watch Cell. This is a special holding area within the unit itself. Still at Polunsky, not yet at Huntsville, where the inmate is placed under intensified supervision. The Death Watch cell is not dramatically different from a standard death row cell in terms of physical layout, but the supervision changes entirely. Officers assigned to Death Watch are specifically selected. They are required to document the inmate's condition, behavior, and statements at regular intervals. Every interaction is logged. This is when inmates typically receive their last visits from attorneys and family members while still at Polunsky. The visitation in that final 24-hour window is face-to-face, not through glass. In some documented accounts, a departure from the standard Polunsky visitation setup that uses physical barriers. Former death row chaplain Carol Pickett, who witnessed 95 executions over his career, has described this period as uniquely suspended, a psychological space that is neither life nor death, where many condemned men become unexpectedly calm. Pickett documented his experiences extensively, noting that the waiting was often harder for prison staff than the condemned appeared to show outwardly. That detail matters, because what? TGAC documentation and first-hand journalistic Accounts reveal is that the system is not designed only to move a body from point A to point B. It is designed to manage the psychological reality of everyone in the building. The officers, the chaplain, the inmate, and the transfer itself. The 45-mile drive that most people assume is the whole story is only one part of a sequence that begins long before any vehicle moves. By the time the transport van pulls up to the Polunsky Unit's secure vehicle bay, hours of documented protocol have already been completed. Searches, identity verifications, legal status confirmations, a final review to ensure no last-minute stay of execution has been filed, and it can be filed right up until the moment the 4-line is inserted. That open legal window, the possibility of a stay arriving by phone, by fax, or electronically in the final hours, is one of the most tension-defining features of the entire process. Execution teams in Huntsville maintain direct communication with the governor's office and the courts until the last possible moment. The van has not moved yet, and already 3 different institutions, the prison, the courts, the executive office of the governor of Texas, are in active coordination. The morning of an execution in Texas follows a pattern that has been repeated, with minor variation, hundreds of times. Texas has carried out more executions than any other state in the modern era of capital punishment, over 580 since 1982, when the state resumed executions after the Supreme Court's temporary moratorium lifted. That number represents a vast body of documented protocol, first-hand testimony from prison staff, investigative journalism, and legal filings that describe in detail what the final hours look like from the inside. The Polunsky Unit. The condemned inmate wakes if they slept in the death watch cell. Breakfast is offered. It is standard institutional food. The special last meal from outside the prison is not served at Polunsky. It is served later at Huntsville in the afternoon before the execution. A significant detail that most people get wrong: the inmate's property is processed. Personal items, letters, books, small objects permitted under TGAC rules are cataloged. The inmate designates who receives what. This is documented in writing, witnessed, and signed. Then the waiting continues, according to journalist Carrie Blakinger, who reported extensively on Texas executions for the Houston Chronicle and later for the Marshall Project. One of the most striking aspects of Death Watch is its bureaucratic normalcy. Forms are completed. Boxes are checked. People speak in measured, professional tones. The machinery of the state does not raise its voice. In the late morning or early afternoon, the transport team arrives. The transport of a condemned inmate from Polunsky to the Huntsville Walls Unit is not done in a standard prison bus. It is a dedicated, secured transport, typically a state-owned vehicle with TGAC markings, staffed by officers specifically assigned execution transport duty. The exact vehicle configuration varies by account, but multiple sources describe a small convoy, the primary transport vehicle, and at least one escort vehicle. The inmate is processed for transport. This means a full search. It means a change into fresh prison whites, the standard TGAC inmate uniform. Restraints are applied, wrist restraints, and in many documented accounts, a full restraint setup that limits movement without being physically painful in the medical sense. The inmate is not handcuffed to the vehicle frame in the manner of a routine prisoner transport, but movement is controlled and supervised at all times. The route from Polunsky to Huntsville covers approximately 45 miles, running southwest through East Texas on US Route 190 and eventually connecting to Interstate 45 south into Huntsville. The drive, under normal conditions, takes roughly 1 hour. During that hour, the vehicle does not stop. This is documented practice. There are no rest stops, no fuel stops, no deviations from the established route. At least one account from a former TGAC office referenced in long-form journalism describes radio communication maintained throughout the drive, updates to Huntsville as the convoy approaches, confirming timing and status. The condemned inmate sits in the secured rear of the vehicle. Some accounts describe the journey as silent. Others describe conversation between the inmate and officers' small talk, or sometimes deeper exchanges. Carol Pickett's memoir describes moments where condemned men looked out the window at the Texas landscape with an almost meditative focus, some reportedly seeing the open sky for the first time in years. Since Polunsky cells do not have exterior windows with meaningful outside views, that detail lands differently when you sit with it. A man who may not have seen open sky, passing cars, or moving trees in a decade, seeing all of it in the last hour of his life, through the window of the van taking him to his execution. The convoy does not announce itself. There are no sirens, no escort lights in most accounts. It moves through regular Texas traffic, past gas stations and fast food restaurants and cars driven by people who have no idea what is in the vehicle beside them on the highway, and then Huntsville appears on the horizon. The Huntsville Unit, called the Walls by everyone who works or has worked inside it, is the oldest prison in Texas, built in the 1840s. Its red brick walls have stood through the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and over 5 decades of modern capital punishment. It is not a maximum security facility in the traditional sense. It houses general population inmates. It operates a significant vocational and educational program. People walk in and out through its administrative sections, and in one precise corner of the building, the state of Texas executes people. When the transport convoy arrives at the Walls Unit, it does not enter through the main public entrance. There is a separate secure intake point, a vehicle bay that allows the transport van to enter within the perimeter before the inmate ever steps onto public ground. The intake process at Huntsville mirrors what happened at Polunsky. Identity is confirmed again. Legal status is confirmed again. A staff member, typically the Walls Unit warden or a senior designee, formally receives the inmate into the Huntsville facility's custody. This handoff is documented. It exists as a legal record. The inmate is then moved to a holding cell directly adjacent to the execution chamber. This cell is not large. It is not designed for comfort, but by documented accounts, it is not punishing either. It is a transition space, a waiting room at the end of everything. This is where the last meal is served. Texas law and TGAC policy allow the condemned inmate to request a specific last meal from a defined menu. The state of Texas famously revised its last meal policy in 2011 after an inmate named Lawrence Russell Brewer requested an enormous meal, multiple entrees, sides, and desserts, and then declined to eat any of it. State Senator John Whitmire called for the policy's elimination. TGAC responded by ending special last meal requests and replacing them with whatever the general prison population was being served that day. That policy change is documented and publicly confirmed. What arrives in that holding cell is not a steak dinner. It is whatever is on the standard TGAC menu for that evening. In the hours between arrival at Huntsville and the scheduled execution time of p.m. Texas executions are scheduled to begin at p.m. The inmate has access to the prison chaplain, to their attorneys by phone, and in some cases, to final visits from approved family members or spiritual advisors in person. The chaplain's role in this period is significant and documented in considerable detail through memoirs and investigative reporting. Carol Pickett, who served as death house chaplain at the Walls Unit from 1980 to 1995, described his role as being physically present with the condemned for the entire duration from intake at Huntsville through the execution itself. He recorded conversations with many of the 95 men he accompanied, later releasing audio of those recordings and writing a memoir. What Pickett's accounts reveal, and what other first-hand testimonies from prison staff confirm, is that this final waiting period is intensely human in ways that are difficult to square with the institutional setting. Men cry, men sleep, men eat, men pray, men talk about their families, their childhoods, their regrets, things entirely unrelated to their crime or their sentence. The officers assigned to death watch during this phase are selected carefully by TGAC. Documentation and journalistic investigation suggest the assignment is not given to everyone. It goes to officers judged capable of maintaining professional composure in an extraordinary situation. Several former officers have given interviews describing the long-term psychological toll of participation in executions, increased rates of PTSD symptoms, sleep disturbance, and moral injury among execution team staff is documented in academic literature examining correctional officer mental health. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because the narrative about executions almost always centers the condemned. Rarely, the officers who stand in that room and carry out the state's order. At some point before p.m., the inmate is moved from the holding cell into the execution chamber itself. The execution chamber at the Huntsville Unit is a small room. That surprises most people. Based on how executions are discussed, the gravity, the formality, the state's full weight bearing down on a single moment, you might expect something vast. A courtroom scale. A cathedral solemnity. The room is roughly the size of a large walk-in closet. At its center is the gurney padded, adjustable, designed to position the human body with arms extended at the sides, at a slight downward angle. The design facilitates for access. It is clinical and specific. According to documentation from the Death Penalty Information Center, first-hand witness accounts, and the detailed reporting of journalists who have attended Texas executions as official witnesses. The restraint process proceeds as follows. The inmate walks from the holding cell into the chamber. They are not carried, not dragged. In virtually every documented Texas execution, the condemned walks in under their own power. This matters legally and procedurally. A person who is unconscious or incapacitated cannot be confirmed to have waive-specific rights in the final moments. The system requires the condemned to be conscious, ambulatory, and legally present until the process is formally initiated. In the chamber, the inmate is assisted onto the gurney. Restraints are applied to the chest, arms, legs, and ankles. A full-body restraint system designed to prevent movement without causing pain. Multiple officers participate in this process. It is completed in minutes. Then the 4 lines are inserted. This is where documented controversy enters the picture. Texas uses a single drug protocol, pentobarbital, a powerful barbiturate for executions. This was not always the case. For years, Texas and most other execution states used a 3-drug protocol, a sedative, a paralytic agent, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. The paralytic agent in the 3-drug protocol became the center of intense legal and medical scrutiny, because critics argued that if the sedative failed to fully render the inmate unconscious, the paralytic would mask visible signs of pain while the inmate experienced the potassium chloride, described by medical experts as intensely painful if experienced consciously. That legal and medical battle, fought in courtrooms across multiple states, including multiple U.S. Supreme Court cases, ultimately contributed to several states, including Texas, shifting protocols. Texas's current use of pentobarbital as a single agent is documented in court records and TGAC public statements. But the sourcing of pentobarbital created its own crisis. As pharmaceutical companies, primarily European manufacturers, refused to allow their products to be used in executions. The supply of compounded pentobarbital became a documented challenge for death penalty states. Texas has faced litigation and public records requests related to its drug sourcing. The state has argued successfully, in multiple courts, that it is permitted to maintain confidentiality about the specific supplier of its execution drugs. That confidentiality is legally established. It is also deeply contested. What it means in practice, the people watching through the one-way glass, the official witnesses, cannot independently verify the quality, concentration, or provenance of the drug entering the 4-line. 2 4-lines are typically inserted. One is the active line. The other is a backup, inserted in case the primary line fails. The 4 is inserted and managed by medical personnel, though here, too, the documentation becomes complex. The American Medical Association prohibits physician participation in executions. This creates a documented tension in every state that uses lethal injection. The procedure requires medical competency to execute correctly. but the medical profession officially prohibits its members from participating. The result, documented in investigative reporting and litigation, is that states use medical personnel, who may be licensed but are operating outside the scope of their professional ethics code, witnesses, file into the adjacent observation room. Texas permits victim family members to witness the execution. The condemned inmate's family may also be permitted to witness. Media representatives, typically a rotating pool of reporters from Texas outlets, are present. Prison officials are present. They watch through a glass window. The warden asks the inmate if they have any final words. This moment, the final statement is entirely voluntary. Texas publishes every final statement given by condemned inmates on its official TGAC website. Hundreds of statements are in the public record. Some are defiant. Some are apologetic. Some are directed entirely at family members in the room. Some are prayers. Some are one sentence. Some, by documented record, are silence. Final words end. The warden steps back. A signal is given. The documented sequence that follows in a Texas pentobarbital execution is: the drug begins flowing through the foreline. In a properly administered execution, the condemned loses consciousness within seconds. Pentobarbital at execution doses produces rapid sedation. The drug then suppresses cardiac and respiratory function. Death is confirmed by a medical professional present in or adjacent to the chamber. The entire process, from the time the drug begins flowing to the official declaration of death, typically takes between 6 and 12 minutes in documented Texas executions, according to accounts from witnesses and official records, but typically carries weight here. Because the history of American lethal injection is also a documented history of procedures that did not go as planned. Clayton Lockett's 2014 execution in Oklahoma, not Texas, but widely cited in documentation about lethal injection failures, involved a ruptured vein that caused the execution drug to absorb into tissue rather than the bloodstream. The execution took 43 minutes. He died of a heart attack. The event triggered a national reassessment of lethal injection protocols and prompted significant litigation across multiple states. In Texas, documented concerns have been raised in specific cases about the time from drug administration to unconsciousness and death, with some witness accounts describing physical reactions during the process that prompted legal challenges. Courts have generally rejected these challenges, with judges ruling that the documented reactions fell within the range of expected sedative effects rather than evidence of conscious suffering. These are contested determinations. What is not contested is that the legal architecture around executions extends to the very last moment. The governor of Texas has the authority to issue a 30-day reprieve. Once, the Board of Pardons and Paroles can recommend clemency. The federal courts can grant a stay. A documented feature of Texas executions is that the warden maintains communication with the governor's office during the execution itself. A phone line, sometimes described as an open line, exists to receive any last-second reprieve. Officers in the chamber are aware of this. The execution team does not proceed until confirmation that no reprieve has arrived. In multiple documented cases, stays of execution have been granted within hours of the scheduled time. In some cases, within the final 24 hours. Henry Lee McCollum, though a North Carolina case rather than Texas, was exonerated from death row after decades, illustrating the stakes of every one of those legal windows. In Texas, specifically, cases like that of Cameron Todd Willingham, executed in 2004 for a house fire that killed his daughters, became among the most debated in American capital punishment history. Post-execution reviews of the fire science used to convict him raised serious questions about the evidence. A state forensic science commission review was initiated and then became politically contested. The case is unresolved in terms of formal exoneration, but it sits permanently in the documented record as a case where the reliability of the underlying evidence was formally questioned after the execution was carried out. That reality, that the process can be completed before all questions are answered, is the permanent unresolved weight at the center of everything described in this video. After the declaration of death, the body is released to the inmate's next of kin if claimed, or handled by the state if no family makes arrangements. The officers who participated in the execution return to their regular duties or are given time away depending on the unit's protocols and the individual officer's needs. The witnesses file out. The chamber is cleaned and prepared for the next use. The Polunsky Unit, 45 miles northeast, continues to house the men still waiting. The process described here has been carried out hundreds of times in Texas alone. It is exhaustively documented. It is legally contested at every stage, and it remains, depending on where you stand, either the careful operation of justice or the systematic machinery of a practice that a growing number of nations and American states have concluded cannot be made just regardless of how carefully it is administered. The facts don't resolve that question, they only make it harder to look away from. If this video made you think differently about what happens inside the justice system, not just in theory but in practice, procedure by procedure, then the next video you need to watch is what happens inside death row itself. The years before the transfer ever happens. What daily life inside the Polunsky Unit actually looks like, who is housed there, how the psychological conditions affect inmates and staff alike, and what the documented research says about what solitary confinement does to a human mind over decades. That video is next. Don't close this tab.